All right, ladies and gentlemen, nice to see you all. I'm delighted to welcome you all back to Tallinn. I'm so grateful that so many of you have made this, for many, long journey all the way here to participate in our conference, but also in this conversation about meeting reality as we're trying to focus on this year. My name is Ingrid Winther. I'm the Norwegian Special Envoy to CCDCOE, and I have the pleasure of being the moderator for today's panel. So for today's panel, I'd like to invite you all to actively participate so that ideally we manage to develop this sort of like natural conversation between the panelists and you guys out there. Low threshold for questions and the likes, but I would ask you to all please make notes and keep your questions until after all three presenters are done, so that we try to see if we can't get this conversation going between the stage and you guys out there. And luckily, we're all brightly lit, so we can even see each other. We'd all like to know who we're talking to, so please do take a moment to introduce yourself when you ask a question. If you dominate the conversation, on the other hand, like in any polite situation, I will cut you off, but in a nice way, I promise. So for today's panel, the first speaker will be Captain Baris Egeman Özkan from the Turkish Navy. Baris has toured both in what we might consider the more traditional domain by serving on warships, but he's also been involved in developing our own field by establishing the SIOC at SHAPE and being their first SIOC plans branch head. Today, he will kick off this session by presenting his research on big picture of domain development, namely operational readiness. Next, we will leave this general assessment and zoom in on the role that the cyber domain has played in Ukraine. This will be Dr. Grace Mueller's mission as she takes us through an empirical analysis. Grace is a postdoctoral fellow at the Army Cyber Institute at West Point. She's also an adjunct lecturer in the Political Science Department at Southern Methodist University. Grace's current research, part of which we will benefit from today, explores how cyberspace affects the various aspects of international relations, particularly the role in war fighting. And finally, I also have the pleasure of inviting CSICON veteran, Professor Martin Libicki, back to CSICON. Martin holds the Kaiser Chair of Cybersecurity Studies at the United States Naval Academy. In addition to teaching, Martin is also a researcher and an author, and today he will share some of his research and analysis on escalation in the cyber domain. Now, Baris, please get our conversation started.
Yeah, thank you. First of all, thank you very much for inviting me here. It's a great pleasure to be among these distinguished speakers and among you guys. Thank you very much. It's always a great opportunity for me to come back to Estonia and explore here. Today, I would like to talk about the zero-day operational cyber readiness, so readiness concept in the cyberspace. There we go. So we have listened this morning from the other speakers as well that we are moving as the digitization is ongoing, and we are moving all our business practices on the cyber terrain. So everything is getting digitized, everything is getting transformed into the cyber geography, basically. So we heard this morning that the total amount of the data in 2022 that has been produced is about 97, 94 zettabytes, and it's expected to have 180 something zettabyte by 2025. It's a huge data. It's a huge environment that we are operating in and through. In addition to that, not only we are moving our business practices, we are also transforming our core values. Somehow we managed to digitize them, and we are also transferring these values onto the cyber terrain as well. So this increase the appetite of the malicious activities. So the number of the malicious activities are also increasing accordingly. So you can see a couple of numbers that I got to pull it up from the internet that it keeps increasing every year and year. So it's almost impossible to predict when and where the next cyber attack will come from. So this is what is usually happening in the regular world business sector. What we also have in the military context, as you might probably recall, the end of the 1990s and the beginning of the 2000s, we had this new concept of the network-centric warfare. So the idea was to move from the platform-centric operations to the network-centric operations, which ended up putting all our platforms weapon systems, command and control systems, sensor systems into the network and making them talk to each other. So they also become digitized and getting smarter and smarter. But the thing is, we are leaving the mid-specs, but we are moving into the technologies and the protocols that the industry is using in our military systems as well. So our military systems are not immune to the cyber attacks that we are facing on a daily basis that I showed you in the previous slide. So we must be ready for all kinds of attacks, not necessarily for the business in the civilian side, but also in the military side, our weapon systems, command and control systems, and the platforms overall, the ships and the aircraft and the tanks must be ready for the cyber attacks as well. So that brings me to the concept of readiness. So what is readiness? As you can see, that's a copy from the US DoD book, joint publication. It's the ability of the military forces to fight and meet the demands of the assigned mission. It's all about getting ready to carry on the job, to get the job done. So it is not a new thing for us. We have always had this readiness concept in the other domains, the maritime domain, air domain, and the land domain. And the idea is to organize, to train, and to equip the personnel and the organizations to make the job done. So when I started my work after the graduation from the academy, my first job was being a shooter on a frigate. And I was a gunner. I was shooting at the targets. And my readiness state for the gun was 5 minutes, not on battle stations, but on regular watch stations. So it means that from the time I decide to shoot and to the time that the ammunition leaves the barrel is 5 minutes. So we have different readiness states in the military. So we have this minutes of readiness state for the scrambled aircrafts. We have there's 60 days to move for the land brigadier or a battalion to move out of the garrison in a given time. So back in time, in the good old days, we had these steamships that had the 4 hours readiness state because it requires 4 hours after you fire up the engine to produce the enough amount of steam to move the ship. So we have all kind of a different readiness states already in our domains. But I want you to pay attention to that. They're all represented by a number. It's 2 minutes, 5 minutes, 30 days, 60 days, or 4 hours. So we have the readiness concept on a time domain already in there. So as Ingrid mentioned, when I was at SHAPE, as we are operationalizing the cyberspace, which means as we are integrating the cyber into other existing functions, the usual tactic that we used was to make analogies, to make the references to already existing procedures, already existing functions. So readiness was one of them. So rather than making up a new one, for the cyberspace readiness, we had the similar concept that we had in the maritime domain, air domain, or the land domain. So you can come up with a table something like this. So anyone with a military background looking at this table and easily understand what it means, because it is on the left-hand side, there's a threat alarm state, which is driven by the intelligence that's telling us the threat is out there, it's coming for you. And then we're moving up and down. It's a red, yellow, green. So we're setting the threat alarm state, and each threat alarm state has an associated readiness state for our platforms or for the modes of operation for our cybersecurity tools. So as the alarm state increases, then we increase the readiness state. And then we increase the man on watch. We can change let's say the web application firewall to the aggressive mode, or we can just shut down the data diode that is a cross-boundary solutions out there. So depending on the threat alarm set, we have this. So it was very easy to communicate such a readiness schema to everyone, and it's already out there. By the way, those sentences, I just made it up. It's not coming up from any book, but it's so easy to communicate this kind of approach. However, when we look at the average time to detect a cyber attack, you can find on some researchers, it's 200 days. So by the time we detect a cyber attack, it has already started almost 7 months ago, all right? Or each time we had these indicators and warnings coming into our play, it is already in there. So malicious actors probably already in our networks by the time they realize that. So this kind of approach that I showed you over here is forward-looking, okay? And it has a spirit of getting prepared for something in the future. but it doesn't work for the cyber domain because we are looking for something that's going to prepare us that has already started 6 months ago in the past. So this didn't work for us. So that's why that was the motivation. That's the driven force for us for this research. So we were looking for something new, a new approach to prepare us for the cyber attacks and in a notional way, in an ideological way, to get it ready minus 200 days. So everything what I've given examples in the past, in like a couple of minutes ago, 2 minutes readiness, 5 minutes readiness, 4-hour readiness, it's something to be happen in the future. But we are looking for a readiness schema that's going to make us ready for something that will likely happen 6 months ago. Basically. So that requires a new perspective, a new approach. And this is what we came up with. It is zero-day operational cyber readiness. So if you can recall from the high school calculus, there's this theory in the limit theory. So if you have a continuous function, and if the inputs are approaching a certain number, the function also approaches a certain number. So that's what it is in a simplistic way. So if we can convert this minus 200 days and extend it to the infinity, this 200 becomes negligible. So it becomes zero. That's the name comes from. It's a zero-day operational readiness. In an ideological word, if it can be ready today and tomorrow again, and the day after tomorrow again, then we will eventually be reaching the zero-day operational cyber readiness. So it's easier to say it than done it. So how are we going to do that? How are we going to come up with a solution? This is our solution, and this is a solution. This is not the solution. So we can just like play around. You can just like take some portions out of it or edit something in it. But this is what we came up with. This model says that under the principles, governing principles, we have resources, and those resources enable, support, and carry on certain activities, security operation activities, and those activities have some outputs that would generate eventually when they converge into capabilities, so they're transformed into capabilities, and those capabilities realize the benefit. So what is the benefit? Benefit is having superiority in and through cyberspace. That's the benefit. If you're going to come back from the backwards, in order to have a superiority in and through cyberspace, we need a certain capabilities in place. In order to have those capabilities, we need the outputs of the certain cybersecurity activities, and those activities requires resources, and on top of that, we need to have the governing principles that sets the boundaries for us. So this is the model that we proposed in our paper. So I'm going to go over each one of these components, but I'm not going to go deeper in them. It's for your reading pleasure. It's in the book. But the principle is out there, so it's not something new. Most of you has already known that. It's the minimize the attack surface, follow the zero trust, follow the risk-based decision-making, defense in depth, persistent situational awareness, data-centric defense, proactive defense are the governing principles in order for us to use any time that we are developing capacity in cyberspace. And we have those resources, and resources are the decision variables of our model, so you can play with around them. So the more investment in those resources, more likely that you will get the zero-day readiness at the end. So our resources are manpower, infrastructure, technology, organization, processes. And some of those resources carry on the activities. Some of them are enabling and supporting the activities that I'm going to be talking now. So those activities are actually tools to use those resources, if I can come back. So to use those resources, which is the potential energy, because just because you have the resources doesn't necessarily make the good for you. You have to turn this potential energy into kinetic energy through those activities. So our manpower, our infrastructure, our organizations, so we put them into our activities like planning, continuous certification and accreditation, continuous assessment, continuous training and exercising, continuous collaboration, and continuous security operations would develop the output, would develop the outcomes that would eventually turn into capabilities when we converge them at the end. So in our capabilities, we named only 3 of them. So we were very simple on this one. Situational awareness, resilience, and unorthodoxly, we put offense in it too. So situational awareness part, we have to understand what the heck is going on in the cyberspace in there. On the sovereign cyberspace and the shared cyberspace, beyond the red line. So we want to know what is going on. So what is the capabilities, what is the intentions, what is our blue pictures, vulnerabilities. We just want to know everything to have recognized cyberspace picture and somehow integrate it into the common operational picture. Resilience is a big word, buzzword. It's already out there, but it's enabling us to be able to withstand any kind of cyber attacks. So it is okay to hit by the cyber attack. It's not okay to not to stand up. So resilience is out there for us with the sub-functions, which is the protection, detection, response, and then recovery. It's also a good tool for the deterrence by denial because we are maximizing the cost of the likely attack. And with a good recovery, we are minimizing the benefit that the adversary is trying to get from this attack. So resilience is one of the capabilities out there. Offense is, we just added up there. I understand that it's a little bit controversial, but we still believe that like the offensive capabilities is a good thing to have in your playbooks because in order to have a good defense, we need to have a good red teaming capability in our organization, in our capacity, so that if it's a peer near like a adversary, it's better, so that we can have a better defensive posture in our organizations. So under the offense, we have the offensive intelligence, threat hunting, attribution capabilities, targeting if you're authorized to do so, the rules of engagements, and also we need to consider the legal aspects. So these three capabilities are the like a merged outcomes of the activities. And once you have those capabilities are realized as benefits at the very end. So the benefit, as I mentioned earlier, is the superiority in and through cyberspace. I make an analogy to the A2AD concept here. So anti-access area denial. So it's well known, especially in the air community. With the cyber A2AD, I try to mean that we have this like a cyber terrain, cyberspace, and small portion of it, we have it. It's our stuff. And there is also shared cyberspace out there. With the cyber A2AD, if we can prevent the penetration of the adversary into the cyber domain, or even if they penetrate into that, if we can deny for them to use the resources in the cyber terrain, we can have a complete control over the cyberspace, and that would eventually end up with superiority in the cyberspace. So those are the benefits that we put it out there. So you can argue that, like especially for the principles-wise, so this is not something new. This is already out there. So those activities that we were doing it anyway. So, but the cyber attacks are still happening. So what is new with this? We are not proposing something new here in terms of the activities or the governing principles. But what we are proposing is to look at it from a different perspective to the readiness, rather than forward-looking and trying to be ready for something that's going to happen in the future, due to the unique attributes and due to the unique nature of the cyberspace, we are looking for readiness, cyberspace readiness, backward-looking to get us ready for something that's happened in the past. So we just want you to have a different way of looking at the end state, but we're not changing the means and ways. This is our strategy. So means and ways are out there, the same activities, the same principles, but we are asking you to change the end state for a different perspective. So we believe that by making this diverse on the readiness, cyberspace readiness, rather than this table that I showed you in a couple of slides ago, that would eventually bring us to the zero-day operational cyber readiness. Yes, it sounds very resource demanding, but we believe that if we can turn all those activities on a daily basis, baseline activity for us, so it's not something that we do on an occasional basis for incident response activities, so it will be a cost-effective in the long run. So I heard that from our colleagues that it's very resource demanding. Yes, in the beginning, it sounds like it, but if you can spread it over all the time, then it will be good for you in the long run. So it incorporates at the end. The offensive capabilities in the readiness concept, that's something that we need to discuss, I believe, in the run. And eventually, hopefully, we will have a different approach to the cyberspace readiness, different than the kinetic domains readiness approach that requires in the cyber domain. Am I good with the timing?
You are perfect on time. Very well done.
So that's it.
Wonderful. I see some diligent scribbling out there, so hopefully, I'm sure I'm not the only one with many questions about this. But again, let's keep them to the end, and we'll make sure we have lots of time left over for a nice conversation later. Grace, floor is yours.
Yes. Let's get this ready. All right. Good afternoon, everyone, and I just want to say thank you to the SciCon organizers for just putting together this wonderful conference. This is my first year attending, and I've just really enjoyed it so far. I am a postdoctoral fellow with the Army Cyber Institute at West Point, and today I'm going to be presenting some of the research that my colleagues Erica Lonergan and Maggie Smith, who's here today with us, have been working on the cyber activity related to the Ukraine war. Specifically, we're going to look at some assumptions that were made about this war and what the data actually shows. So as it became increasingly clear that Russia was preparing for military action in Ukraine, cyber experts began to offer a number of different predictions about what the cyber dimension of this conflict might look like. Specifically, there were three broad assumptions that were made about the pre-war cyber conversation. The first assumption was that many assumed that a Russian conventional assault on Ukraine would be preceded or take place in conjunction with a major cyber offensive campaign. So a related assumption to this was that Russia would conduct widespread and significant cyber attacks against Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Or they might even do this in lieu of a conventional attack. So that was kind of one broad assumption. A second common assumption was that Russia would coordinate cyber offensive operations with kinetic military operations on the battlefield. So cyberspace would be kind of an integral part of a military invasion on the ground. Again, the implication of this was that national critical infrastructure might especially be vulnerable in Ukraine. And finally, many expected Russia would launch waves of sophisticated cyber attacks beyond the theater of operations in Ukraine, specifically targeting the United States and NATO members in order to retaliate against Western actions, specifically such as the economic sanctions that these countries were implementing on Russia. So in this presentation, leveraging an original data set on cyber activity related to the 2022 Russian invasion of Ukraine, I'm going to explore the extent to which these three assumptions played out when we look at the data. So to analyze, in order to evaluate these assumptions, data was needed. So to analyze the role of cyberspace in warfighting in the Russo-Ukrainian war, the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, in conjunction with the Army Cyber Institute at West Point, developed an original data set on cyber incidents from the conflict. Specifically, this data set covers cyber activity from actors supporting Ukrainian or Russian war efforts. We decided to collect data far back as March 2021, nearly a year before the invasion of Ukraine, in order to identify evidence of cyber behavior that might have been preparation for the conventional conflict. Why? Given the long time horizons that are often associated with offensive cyber operations, as Baris was just explaining. So phase one of this data collection ends in August 2022, but we're currently in the process of extending this data further. So we're really going to just be able to speak to the early phases of this war. That said, between March 2021 and August 2022, we identified 131 unique cyber events. 61 of those incidents, making up about half of our data, took place in Ukraine, and so we're going to kind of analyze those specifically today. 29 incidents took place in Russia, so about about 1/5. And we have 31 incidents that took place outside of Russia and Ukraine, and so we're going to speak to that and how this relates to NATO. Finally, in order to speak to whether there might be a cyber conventional coordination, we map cyber events to conventional conflict, and I'll describe that in a few minutes. So our first assumption, right, the cyber shock and awe. Concerning this assumption, we actually find that despite a notable volume of cyber incidents and activity, there's little evidence of a significant cyber attack on Ukrainian critical infrastructure. Considering the cyber events that have occurred in both Ukraine and Russia, instead, the overwhelming majority involved intelligence operations or cyber-enabled espionage, as depicted in this table. So you can see that for both Ukraine and Russia, intelligence operations are definitely the majority. These incidents are characterized by probing, packet sniffing, and reconnaissance. And in general, we would not expect cyber intelligence operations like this to be associated with escalation, just given the absence of effects coupled with the tacit understanding between states that cyber espionage is generally an acceptable form of statecraft. But we want to kind of further unpack this cyber shock and awe, so we look at targeting patterns. When we look at this, we're trying to see is who's on the receiving end of these cyber incidents and if that can kind of raise awareness or alarm. But when we looked at the targets of cyber activity, the overwhelming majority for all states in the data are government entities followed by private entities. So for example, you can see that in Ukraine, government actors are heavily targeted 77% of the time. It is important to note that the multiple targets can occur in a cyber incident, but that said, 77% of the time in Ukraine, a government actor was on the receiving end. In Russia, we also have a high number of government actors targeted, but instead the majority appear to be private actors instead. But for the purpose of this cyber shock and awe, I want to draw attention to that third column, that military column. During the period of our study, only 31% of all recorded cyber events that took place in Ukraine targeted military entities. And so these are defense organizations that can include both cyber and non-cyber military or intelligence entities. And considering Russia, of the 29 incidents that took place there, 0% targeted military actors. This was especially surprising just given the war fighting, the kinetic war fighting that took place on the ground at the time. That said, we do acknowledge that there is some bias in what might be reported, right? Because military actors probably have a disincentive to report such information. But right, from our data that we looked at, very few were targeting military actors. To further unpack this, we do look at critical infrastructure. So when we look at critical infrastructure, we are looking at this breakdown. So we have a number of different things, and I'm just going to draw our attention to the ones that are labeled defense. Right, none of the incidents that took place in our data set are recorded as having targeted the defense industrial sector. And so just kind of, and this is just showing Ukraine, for example. So none targeted the defense industrial sector, which might cause some kind of questions because this was an assumption that people just made at the beginning. When we examine specific cyber incidents, the one that is most consistent with assumption that Russia would conduct a paralyzing cyber strike at the outset of the conflict, the Viasat telecommunications hack comes to mind. This took place on February 24th, 2022, just 1 hour before the Russian army crossed into Ukraine. The evidence does strongly suggest that the Viasat cyber attack was part of Russia's plan for the initial phase of the campaign. And reporting indicates that in the first 72 hours of the conflict, Russia sought to paralyze Ukrainian command and control, as likely a part of a decapitation strategy through both kinetic and non-kinetic means. Yet while this cyber incident might be considered an operational success, experts have concluded that there is no information that this hack worsened the communication within the Ukrainian military. So it doesn't appear that Russia was able to capitalize on this temporary disruption in Ukrainian C2 in the immediate aftermath of the Viasat attack. This first assumption, this cyber shock and awe, it appears that there has been a lack of a significant cyber shock and awe campaign on the part of Russia, at least in the early phases of the war, which our data can speak to. What accounts for this surprising ineffectiveness of Russian offensive cyber operations throughout the conflict? Analysts have suggested a range of potential explanation. Gavin Wild, for example, articulates 3 potential causes: the relative inexperience of Russia's information troops, 2, bureaucratic rivalry and infighting over resources and prioritization, especially between the GRU and FSB, and we're going to get to threat actors in just a little bit. And 3, the inability to shape the war in its opening phases, as depicted in this Viasat attack. Others, however, have attributed Russia's lack of strategic success in cyberspace to the effectiveness of the Ukrainian cyber defenses that are aided in collaboration with government and private sector partners, which has been a conversation that we've heard a lot today. The second common assumption about the war was that Russia would coordinate cyber operations with military operations on the battlefield, right? That there would be this partnership between cyber and conventional. To speak to this assumption, we decided to map the patterns of cyber operations to the phases of the conventional campaign. Specifically, what we did is we used the U.S. military's dominant paradigm for joint operations, which is a planning construct that consists of 6 phases: shape, deter, seize the initiative, dominate, stabilize, and enable civil authority. We used those 6 operational phases for conventional military campaigns from the Russian perspective in order to categorize our cyber event data. So you can see in this table, right, this is just including data up until August 22. We have seen the phases of the war, so from shape to deter to seize the initiative and to dominate. And as we're extending our data, it's important to note that there can be fluctuations and we can kind of go back in time and we can fall back to deter, seize the initiative. But just glancing at that data, we can see that cyber operations have indeed changed over the course of this conflict. While it would be a step too far to make causal inferences from this data, just because we only have 131 incidents, the patterns of cyber operations when mapped to the conventional campaign, right, moving from intelligence to effects in 2 different ways, as depicted in those bold text, they're consistent with the idea that cyber campaigns take time to develop and they involve an initial investment in intelligence collection. And therefore, they might be difficult to synchronize with other aspects of the broader military campaign. Right? If we look at specific examples, like case studies that might cause us to think of, hey, a cyberkinetic example. One potential is the failed cyber attack on Ukraine's power grid, which occurred on July 1st, 2022. In this incident, a pro-Russian hacker group called ZACnet targeted a power company called DTEK. This cyber incident actually took place at the same time that Russian forces were carrying out missile attacks on DTEK's thermal power plant, leading one Ukrainian cyber official to point to this as evidence of the kinetic cyber coordination. Nevertheless, according to John Bateman, kinetic attacks on Ukrainian power infrastructure have been a routine feature of this war, and the cyber incident hasn't been directly attributed to this thermal facility, so perhaps coordination claims are not as strong as they appear. Finally, our third assumption was that of cyber spillover, right? That we would see conflict beyond the theater of operations in Ukraine. And in many ways, this is the one assumption that stood up most clearly to the evidence, the empirical scrutiny, because our data reveals significant cyber activity targeting Western countries as well as the Russian homeland itself. As depicted in this table right here, 33 of the cyber incidents in our data, making up about 25% of the data, targeted NATO member states during the time period that we examined. Germany, Latvia, and Italy have been the most frequently targeted states. Again, this is between March 2021 and August 2022, with the preponderance of these DDoS attacks being carried out by hacktivist groups. Specifically, Killnet is on the launching side of those attacks. The United States has also been on the receiving end of malicious cyber activity related to the Ukraine war, with 3 instances of cyber attacks targeting US targets. However, all of this cyber activity has largely taken the place of nuisance cyber attacks that are perpetrated by patriotic hackers and hacktivist groups rather than destructive campaigns ordered by the Russian government against critical infrastructure. So right, those 3 assumptions, we don't really find support for the first 2 assumptions. We do find more support for that 3rd assumption of cyber spillover. But with all of this in mind, what are some of the patterns from our data that we can speak to that perhaps have been overlooked by experts in the early stages of the war? First, we argue that there was just too little focus on the role of third-party actors. Indeed, one of the most striking findings of our analysis was the preponderance of cyber activity stemming from non-state actors that were not directly affiliated with governments, such as Anonymous, Killnet, and the IT Army of Ukraine. Specifically in our data, we find that 25 different threat actors were responsible for the 61 cyber incidents that took place just in Ukraine alone. With some actors obviously being more active than others, but still it's not just as black and white as we might have assumed. Second, our research indicates that the threat actor groups do appear to concentrate on certain targets as well as certain types of cyber campaigns. Anonymous, for example, has a strong proclivity for launching cyber-enabled espionage operations, and it mainly targets private actors 2/3 of the time. Killnet, on the other hand, has a proclivity for cyber effects operations, and it targets government actors most of the time. Again, those are just 2 examples, but in our data, we do find this kind of tendency to concentrate on specific targets as well as specific types of cyber operations. To conclude, I would like to offer 3 important policy implications that stem from our analysis, just in light of this data. The first is that there are constraints on cyber power of cyber operations. Much of the cyber activity seen in Ukraine during our timeframe of analysis has been on intelligence operations or disruptive attacks. And the effects of these are limited and transient, with targets rapidly being able to recover or restore functionality. There's a number of different examples, but the Viasat attack, they were able to quickly recover from that. As a result, these cyber incidents are not generating the cost severe enough, leading to meaningful change in the overall conflict. Again, especially compared to the violence wrought by kinetic conventional capabilities. Second, we find that cyber conflict in Ukraine has manifested itself in ways that correspond to cyber access and capability development times, potentially in ways that are mismatched to actions on the battlefield. Right? Why might this be? Why do we have that disconnect? It could be that it's the fog of war complicating operational planning. And we argue that this results in belligerents not being able to enjoy the luxury of long time horizons. These challenges do not necessarily indicate weakness or incompetence, but rather just illuminate how difficult it is to integrate cyber capabilities into military planning. And as a result, policymakers should avoid overconfidence in drawing conclusions about the maturity or immaturity of Russian cyber capabilities, as well as the feasibility of implementing their own operational concepts in a warfighting environment. And finally, a third policy implication is just that given the proliferation of non-state actors engaged in this digital battle space recorded in our data, policymakers should anticipate that future conflicts are likely to have a third-party component, specifically a third-party cyber component. The fact that most of the cyber spillover in Ukraine has been conducted by these actors, and specifically the cyber activity targeting NATO states, that it's been conducted by hacktivist groups and patriotic hackers rather than directly by a government, raises questions about how to prepare for and defend against this type of activity and ensure that guardrails are in place to prevent attacks from inadvertently escalating future conflicts. But that's all I have for this, and I look forward to any questions that come about.
Great. Thank you so much, Grace. I find it really interesting how Baris's presentation focuses on readiness, essentially. And I'd love to see, behind the scenes what readiness might have meant for the Ukrainian defenders, because that would obviously affect the outcome of your data. Also, like how you end on escalation. Really, both of your points all about trying to avoid that escalation from galloping away from us. And luckily, that is what Martin is here to talk about. So Martin, what would escalation look like in the cyber domain?
Good thing that you asked. Okay, good afternoon. A big thank you to the organizers for inviting me to speak today. I propose to talk about conflict escalation, examine the role of thresholds in modulating it, and then ask how thresholds may apply to cyber conflict. We start with a metaphor of the escalation ramp, and thus the problem of managing or at least channeling conflict escalation. Imagine a ball on this line. And in this metaphor, escalation is driven by the winds of war, stemming from the urge to fight and win. And countering escalation is an understanding that escalated warfare has grave consequences. If the winds are strong and gravity is weak, the ball goes up and to the right, okay? If the winds of war abate or the gravity of consequences become more apparent, then the ball stops rolling. Escalation, in and of itself, is motivated by the belief that if you increase the intensity of your effort or do what you refrained from doing before, military outcomes improve or you may drive the other side to quit. Escalation is discouraged by the prospect that your escalation will prompt their escalation, leaving no one better off. And it's also discouraged by the fact that among nuclear-armed countries, it may lead to Armageddon. But the question is, are those two factors enough to quell the prospects of escalation? Now, here we're going to go to a different slide in which we introduce the role of thresholds in modulating escalation. The blue line, you saw it before, represents escalation ramp without threshold. The red jagged line represents an escalation ramp with thresholds. Shown here is speed bumps, which, to continue the metaphor, offer a chance to stop the ball depending on the relative strengths of the wind and the gravity, and of course the seriousness and height of the speed bumps themselves. Thresholds are mutually understood barriers to escalation. Although they can be bypassed, they cannot be bypassed casually. They force both sides to cross them consciously, and they could create a tacit understanding that as long as one side refrains from crossing the threshold, the other side will refrain as well. This implies that successful thresholds should be clear. That is to say, you will know when you cross it, and you will know when they cross it. Thresholds can be defined by the means by which conflict is conducted, and cyber and kinetic are considered two different means, or it can be discussed in terms of what ends or targets may be deemed eligible or ineligible. And here we have as an example a homeland threshold. You can do certain things here, but you cannot do certain things over there. This is an important issue for evaluating any one instance of cyber conflict. Do we judge it as escalation by the means used, or do we judge it as escalation by the effects that it produced? The most widely recognized thresholds are those that, 1, separate peace from war, and 2, the nuclear taboo. Unfortunately, information technology in general, and cyberspace operations in particular, have a tendency to erode both thresholds. And 2, the space between peace and nuclear war is really too large to leave without any thresholds in between. But to understand what kind of thresholds are associated with cyber conflict, it's useful to introduce one other consideration here on the next slide. Okay? The metaphor of escalation is typically that of a ladder. Ladders and escalators are sort of one-dimensional objects, okay? In a one-dimensional metaphor, every conflict state is either more or less intensive than another conflict state, and furthermore, reaching the next conflict state means that conflict states that are higher are therefore all the more likely to be reached. Now, one might infer that linearity is an oversimplification from something I just said, which is to say that thresholds can be defined by either means or ends. As Olesya Kacheva and I argued at a SciCon in 2020, this is the fall SciCon, escalation is probably thought of as more like a lattice. There are multiple escalation paths, and when there are, you can find intermediate states on both paths that are not comparable to one another. So let me give you an example. Let us imagine a naval confrontation between NATO and Russian forces in the Baltic. Okay, they stare at each other for a while, and the confrontation ends when both navies basically withdraw from each other. But at the same time, you start seeing one or both countries starting to carry out strategic cyber war on each other's electrical grid. So here's the question. Did we see escalation or did we see de-escalation? I don't have an answer to that question because it's important to realize that people will have different points of view. Some people will look at it and says, well, the prospect of violence has gone down, so it's de-escalation. Other people will say, well, we have gone from a conflict between militaries to a conflict between societies, and therefore it's escalation. Well, why does any of this matter? One answer is that in a one-dimensional escalation ramp, it's pretty clear where cyber conflict fits. It's not quite peace, and it's not quite war, okay? But on the lattice, cyber conflict becomes a much more confounding escalation option. A non-lethal cyber attack on nuclear command and control, for instance, occupies a very different spot on the lattice than, say, a lethal state-supported ransomware attack on a hospital. Okay? There are various elements of incomparability between the two. Okay, that's the general principles. Now let's talk about cyberspace in particular. And we start off with the next question. Is cyber war war? Okay, my usual response to that question is that cyber war is war if you think it's war, okay? That reframes the question, as it should. It really doesn't answer it. Academic thought on the subject, notably by Jacqueline Schneider and Brendan Valeriano, says that cyber war is not war. War games suggest that given two scenarios featuring equivalent damage, the one caused by cyber attack is less likely to lead to conflict escalation than the one caused by kinetic attack. I think that insight is basically correct, but it's also highly context dependent, and the context being the world in which we live. Would this tenet hold if cyber attacks were proven to have more serious effects, which to date they haven't? Or would this tenet hold if we were closer to Cold War II, to use Professor Anderson's nomenclature, than we are currently today? Okay? I want to introduce two other considerations. And that is, the answer to the question, is it war, is it not war, is less important than agreement on the question. And let me explain why. If both parties conclude that cyber war is not war, okay, then they are more apt to carry out cyber war, but escalation from cyber war to kinetic conflict becomes less likely. If both countries conversely think that cyber war is war, they are less likely to carry out cyber attacks, but if they do, the road to escalation becomes easier. Both characteristics are more or less stable. What's unstable is if the attacker thinks that cyber war is not war, and the defender thinks that cyber war is war. And then you get inadvertent escalation. Because, in fact, neither side thinks it's escalating. But when you put the two together, you end up with escalation. Another characteristic is that war may not be war. Now, what do I mean by that? Okay? To wit, a conflict that threatens the sovereignty of a country is different conflict than one that has a tit-for-tat affair. Okay, the former would be, for instance, the Arab-Israeli wars of 1967 and 1973. The latter would be better to describe current interactions between Israel and Iran over Syria. The relevance of this distinction for cyber war is that if cyber war escalates, it's much more likely to escalate into a tit-for-tat confrontation than it is to escalate to a war over sovereignty. Because in order to have a war over sovereignty, you need a very different politics than the war that's a tit for tat. And the escalation ladder, or lattice or whatever, that goes past a tit for tat war, or basically progresses through that, is a very different escalation ladder that follows a war over national sovereignty, okay? Because they're motivated by different factors. Okay, let's go to the next slide. Is cyber war anti-system warfare? Now, system warfare is a concept that has been brooded about by the Chinese as part of their A2AD, anti-access area denial strategy, and it's been picked up by American analysts as a way to describe the Chinese. Okay? So, is cyber war considered of a piece with non-lethal anti-system conflict? The latter being destructive attacks on things, notably, but not necessarily, C4ISR things. There seems to be a growing consensus that the destruction of machines such as UAVs prompts a less serious response than the destruction of manned aircraft. Okay, this was made manifest in airfights between Turkey and Russia over Syria. It was also demonstrated when the United States retaliated for Iran's takedown of a Global Hawk aircraft with cyber attacks on Iran's military databases. Okay, were a threshold developed between non-lethal and lethal operations and no threshold developed between cyber and other non-lethal operations, then among countries that respected such thresholds, a kinetic response to a particularly severe cyber attack would be in bounds, but escalation to lethal combat would be less likely. Of this possibility, 2 points should be made. First, in fairness, such a threshold isn't really discussed very much, even though it seems to be in a tacit way in operation. Second, it is unclear that a threshold between non-lethal anti-system destruction and lethal combat would be in NATO's interests, because such a threshold creates disadvantages for militaries that use unmanned assets vis-a-vis militaries that do not. The militaries that do not can attack the former's assets without the former being able to strike back effectively without crossing the threshold. Okay? Among other things, such a threshold makes the world safe for warfare in outer space, and I'm not really willing to say that that's a good thing. Okay? Third, the same stability interests that are served by a consensus on cyber war are also served by a consensus on whether anti-system non-lethal conflict is in fact substantially different from lethal conflict. Okay, the usual reason. If both sides see a threshold, that's a barrier to escalation. If one side sees a threshold here and the other side sees a threshold there, that's an invitation for unwanted escalation. Okay, let's do another comparison on this slide. How does cyber war stand vis-a-vis sanctions in terms of escalation? Okay, admittedly, this is an asymmetric question because NATO and its friends can impose much more meaningful sanctions on others than those others can impose on NATO and its friends. And at this point, even China has going to be a harder time imposing economic sanctions than NATO can. Okay, so keep that in mind. Although cyber attacks and economic sanctions are both non-destructive, hence non-lethal, economic sanctions can be much more costly to endure. The effects of Western sanctions on Russia look to be, and this is where I do one of these things, okay, roughly in the $100 billion a year range. By contrast, the most costly cyber attack, which was not Petya, was a one-time cost of about $5 to $10 billion. Okay, so that would seem to be that sanctions could be escalation vis-a-vis cyber. But now let's look at it from another perspective. Trade is a voluntary activity. Therefore, the suspension of trade is also a voluntary activity, right? Trade sanctions are not considered the use of force under international law or anything like it. But cyber operations do impose one party's will on the other systems, and can be likened, although I don't want to get into an argument with the lawyers about whether this is really true, can be likened to an act of war. Okay, but by that metric, going from sanctions to cyber, would be escalation. Okay, now I'm going to go into the world of absurdity. Does cyber war belong in the same bucket as nuclear war? Okay? Now, we know, for instance, that there was a 2013 Defense Science Board report on resilient systems, which mooted the possibility that a sufficiently severe cyber attack could be met with nuclear retaliation. We also know that the U.S. Nuclear Posture Review of 2018 basically mooted the possibility of a cyber response to a cyber attack, again, of sufficient consequence. Okay? Statements by sober analysts that speculate on Russia's current escalation. They say, well, what could Russia do? And they include both tactical nuclear use and cyber attacks on the West, notwithstanding that cyber attacks on Ukraine have been going on since 2014. Conversely, Admiral Stavridis, the former SACEUR, included cyber attacks of one way of effectively retaliating against a hypothetical Russian use of tactical nuclear weapons. Let me just say, if there are no thresholds between cyber war and nuclear war, there are no thresholds whatsoever. Okay, if you can't make a distinction there, you're out of the distinction business entirely. Okay, so where does one draw the line here in this graph between peace, cyber conflict, anti-system conflict, and lethal conflict? Okay, and I have 3 questions: here, here, and here. Okay, each of these answers produce different implications for escalation. Okay, so just to repeat myself, if it's on the left-hand side, going from peace to cyber conflict is easy, but from cyber conflict all the way to lethal conflict becomes easier, right? If you go to the next one, you have a separation between cyber conflict and anti-system conflict. So it's easier to get to cyber conflict, hard to get to anti-system conflict, but once you're there, easier to get to lethal conflict. Okay, and the third arrow is basically just continues that notion. So I'm sure some of you are asking in the audience, let's choose all 3. Okay, here's a problem, other than the fact you're cheating. Okay, the problem is that would you rather have one tacit promise, which because it's singular is paid attention to, or 3 tacit promises because there are those before and after it, in fact, are not being very well paid attention to? Okay, a threshold in many ways is like a promise. And one of the central features of a promise is if you break a promise, you're not credible for your next promise, which means that you have to very, very carefully decide where you're going to draw the line and where you're going to issue your threats, and conversely, where you're going to issue your promises. Okay? So, let's go to the conclusion. Establishing normative and positive thresholds may help modulate the risk of uncontrolled escalation, but it's not a freebie, because by putting thresholds in certain places, you basically flatten the ground for escalation in other places. So it's important to choose wisely. But since thresholds tend to be, unilateral thresholds are not particularly useful, if you're going to have meaningful thresholds, you have to have them through some process of dialogue, which means dialogue not only with your friends, but what's a little more difficult, dialogue with people you don't like very much. Okay? And that, I would offer, is a central challenge of thresholds, and by extension, the central thresholds of any central challenge of any thresholds that deal with cyber.
Excellent. Thank you, Martin. You know, I think it's another interesting distinction with this domain compared to the other domains. We like to try to use these analogies, be it nuclear war, or try to use the same readiness table as for other tools of warfare. But really, what you're describing is that in this domain, reality has very little to do with what is actually happening. It is more a question of perspective and how we choose to describe things.
Well, you sparked 2 comments. One of them, when I teach my students this thing, I say, look, deterrence is 100% perception. Reality doesn't matter. You're trying to affect somebody's mind. It's what they think is important that counts. There was a quote I read somewhere that asserted that we have the right to determine what is escalation. And I said, and in all practical purposes, that's completely backwards. It's escalation if the Russians think it's escalation, right? The other note I just want to throw out, when I started in this field back in the early 1990s, pretty much all the metaphors for cyber came from the nuclear era. And we had to spend a lot of time working our way away, working against those metaphors to be able to understand cyber for what it was and not just a less radioactive form of nuclear war, okay? And I think it's time that, in fact, it may not be a bad idea to take the metaphors that we develop from thinking about cyber war and start thinking about other forms of combat using those metaphors, even up to nuclear war, which is such a pre-cyber thing to do.
Fair enough. I think we have to quote Ross Anderson again. You have to say what you mean and mean what you say when discussing this field.
And raising children, yes.
Exactly. It's also interesting, pulling back to Grace's empirical analysis where, you know, these operations, I think you said like 30% of them or something, that wouldn't, like, your sort of day-to-day operations that wouldn't necessarily lead to escalation, but conceivably, there would be a scenario where someone chooses to define that differently because escalation is suddenly desired.
Exactly. I think part of what was interesting about our research project was we were studying a war-fighting context. So much of cyber before the Ukraine war, unfortunately, was just all kind of conjecture and theory. And so we haven't done an extensive amount of this, but when we're looking at escalation patterns within the context of the Ukraine war, we're not finding a lot of it. Right? You might look at a failed cyber attack and see if that's followed up with, you know, kind of secondary or third cyber attacks, or maybe a failed cyber attack that leads to a conventional escalation. And we're doing this on a case study by case study basis, and we're just not finding support for that. So like when we're studying a war-fighting context, we're just not seeing that escalation. And so that's something that perhaps could change as the war, with more data and the war is continuing. But yeah, I think it's always important to look at data as well as kind of the theory and kind of the research.
Baris, do you think your model, not to change the means and tools, but to change how we perceive cyber readiness, do you think this could affect also then our perception of, or how would that affect really our perception of escalation, do you think? Or would it even, for that matter?
Well, it would and it wouldn't. In both ways, I would say it depends on how you utilize and how you use those activities and the resources in this model. If you go like in an aggressive way to the right-hand side, that could have like an instrument to escalate it, and at the same time could have been used also de-escalated in a controlled manner. So it depends on how you use it. It's already out there.
Yeah, interesting. At this point, I'm abusing my power as moderator and dominating in the conversation, which I promised to stop other people from doing, so I should probably throw it out to you guys. I assume there are some questions to our panelists after their presentations. I'll think we'll do it one at a time, and if people have a follow-up, feel free to, do this thing, because it would be interesting to, follow one lead before we start a new topic. I think I saw the first hand right here.
Oh, hello. Thanks for the presentations. They were very, very interesting. I want to direct my question to Professor
Sorry,
Libicki.
could we ask your name, please?
Oh, I'm sorry. Eduardo from University of Brasilia.
Thank you.
I'm going to ask you, Professor Libicki, abusing the idea of family analogies. Usually my wife chooses a threshold, and it's not necessarily because that particular fault was the main cause, but the aggregate effect. So I'm drawing inspiration from my particular experience, and also Max Mead and Fisher Keller that talked about the aggregate effects of cyber operations. And do you think that's an additional factor that complicates the idea of, pinpointing a precise or forming consensus on a precise threshold for cyber conflict? Thank you.
Well, I don't want to get into your family situation very much. Let me offer this, okay? Escalation is not about what you do. It's about what you don't do, right? And the whole notion of thresholds is up to this point. We have not done this, right? And now we do this. Okay, if you take a look at thresholds in the form of a taboo, right? As in the term nuclear taboo, but in fact it has a wider remit. Then the question becomes, can you in fact go back on a threshold, right? Now, I realize I'm going to go far afield from your family, but let me just make a point. One of the concerns I have, particularly vis-a-vis the Chinese, is that the Chinese tend to have a view of escalation as a thermostat. You can set it up and down. And they judge escalation not by how far you've gone, but by how easily you can pull it back. The West doesn't do it that way. And the West has a tendency, right? Here I am in the West. The West has a tendency in many ways to moralize these things. And the taboo is a very moralization point of view, okay? So once you cross the threshold, unless it's understood to be an accident or inadvertent, a one-time thing, right? Then it's broken. And once it's broken, you can't go back over this. So these are all notions that suggest, in fact, that quantity is interesting only insofar as it validates a breaking of a taboo. Or you went there, and now that you went there, you can't go back because you've gone there. Okay? And if we're going to talk metaphors, you got boiling frogs and straws that break the camel's back, right? That's a nice thing about metaphors. They're all over the place.
Thank you.
And I wish you and your wife luck.
Well, with some family therapy from stage here, would you guys like to add anything to this question, or do we grab the next one?
I'm good.
Yep.
Yeah.
All right. Hand in the back, please.
Hello, thank you very much for the brief. Antoine Landry from NATO ACT. We'll have a session on CIV-MIL collaboration on Friday, so probably I'm kind of jumping ahead of Friday's discussion, but I would be very happy to get your feedback on what could be the role of third parties, such as the private sector, when it comes to escalation and desescalation. I think in the case of Ukraine, that was very well highlighted that third-party actors, such as the private sector, is playing a key role. And when it comes to escalation and desescalation, we tend to think, at least that's the case for myself, to country A against country B or Russia taking an action for escalation. But in fact, industry might be brought into a conflict or might act and basically drive the escalation process. So again, I would be very happy to get your thought on how the third party and especially the private sector could play a role in the escalation and desescalation process.
Yeah, I'll speak to that. Thank you for your question. I do think that, right, our data set is specifically focusing on conflict, not offensive conflict, not necessarily the defensive cyber aspect. But I do think that that is a huge role, right? We only observed 61 incidents of cyber attacks, cyber incidents within Ukraine within about a year, a little over a year time span. Perhaps that number could have been a lot higher had the Ukrainian defenses not been as strong as they were. And I do think that's a story to be said. But specifically what we found in our research, and it's still kind of unfolding, is just this role of non-state actors. And I think from the outset of the war, or just the everyday citizen around the world watching this conflict, is we're just kind of thinking binary Russia versus Ukraine, but there's much more gradation there. So hacktivists are big, as well as kind of not even hacktivist groups, but just third-party actors, sometimes just individuals who are kind of participating. Sometimes it's this patriotic effort. But I do think in terms of the kind of the public-private partnership, specifically that has to do a lot with the cyber defenses of Ukraine. And I wish that's something we're going to continue to look into, but our specific project kind of is just focusing on the offensive side. But that is definitely something that had the defense not been as strong, I wonder if we would have seen more cyber attacks in Ukraine.
Interesting.
Can I jump in here?
Please.
This is actually, the question as I understand it is a subset of a broader question, which is to say, to what extent are states responsible for the activities of non-state actors within their country? Okay, and there are two ways of slicing this. One is the strategic level, and that is to say, the only good reason to blame a state for non-state actors is if you believe that the state has influence on non-state actors. Okay, and depending on the non-state actors, right? The United States, we get a lot of drugs in from Mexico, but we don't blame the Mexican government because we believe the Mexican government is doing all they can to do that. So us punishing the Mexican government would not make it, would be a stupid idea, right, because of that. On the other hand, if you take a look at Russian hackers, we know that they have been condoned by the Russians, and the Russians have alternatively sometimes condoned them and sometimes not condoned them. So the notion of putting pressure on Russia because of their non-state actors makes a good deal more sense. But that's from the strategic point of view. When you actually ask how countries react, a lot of it has to do with their narrative, right? And sometimes even if you don't think that a government has control over their hackers, for narrative purposes, you might want to make that assumption, right? My adversaries are bad. This is how bad they are. They sneak attacks. They use the cover of non-state actors, which proves that they're bad. And that narrative then tends to drive what you do forward. Narrative and strategy sometimes can get you in very different places. Mm-hmm. Unfortunately, I can't tell you that one is more important than the other.
But we're back to perception, really, and how we choose to present things and choose to see things. Yeah. I think we had a question right here, please. We'll get a mic one moment.
Thank you so much. Hi, I'm Karen Kateri from Army Cyber Institute, so go West Point. I'm wondering what each of your frameworks looks like if we add the civil dimension to it. I think about Herman Kahn's escalation ladder. At the ultimate end of it is population evacuation. And we kind of stopped talking about that during the Cold War because it was too grim to think about. But it's there. And that's what cyber is strategic about, is that it can hold a population at risk, right? You can poison the water systems or take out the power. So I'm wondering if you add that civilian resilience to your narrative. So in your ZeroDay, you also have the resilience of those systems around the fort that enable your military to move to the port, right? That in Ukraine, you have the narrative of the population being able to withstand the attacks and to be prepared for the disinformation campaigns. So where does that fit, though, if you're going to try to operationalize that in your frameworks?
All right. So that is true that we are more and more reliant on the civilian infrastructures as we are planning our operations. So this is inevitable out there, and that's a very big challenge for the planners, military planners, to have them included in our planning process. That is also a big challenge to understand the vulnerabilities in those assets that's supporting and enabling our operations. And understanding exact vulnerabilities in those systems is a big question mark. And if we are going for a coalition operation where more than one nation is getting involved, this kind of information is not to be shared by the others at all. So that is basically the operation planning process is turning into a risk management practice for the operational planner to understand the worst case scenarios to support our operational troops in there. You're perfectly correct that that argument, that parameter needs to be again put into our calculation. That's why the public-private partnership, public-private interaction getting very important. And it's as a peacetime activity, having more and more interaction with the private sector. I'm talking about from the military perspective, but having discussions with the private sector that's likely to be supporting our future operation in the future would be a good practice. And having that included into our model would be a good idea for the operational planners.
Good question. Thank you.
And just
Grace.
continuing on with that, I think in terms of kind of how this plays out in the Ukraine war, we have seen a lot of kind of educational outreach to Ukrainian citizens about just like hypersensitivity to about phishing attacks, as those that has made up a lot of the incidents that have appeared in our data. And so, right, when it says targeting government entities, sometimes that's pretending to be a government actor that's sending it out to the Ukrainian people, and they think it's from a Ukrainian official, so they click on it. Right, to dupe them for a phishing incident. But right, I think Ukraine's done a really good job of kind of outreach, and they've improved over time but just this vigilance. In the same way, I think a takeaway from the data, and again, it's still developing, but in the same way that we have disaggregation in terms of threat actors, right? It's not just Russia versus Ukraine. We have lots of gradation. I think in the same way, it goes with targets as well. We have even to the lowest of individuals. For an example of a telegram or a Facebook of a Ukrainian military individual being hacked, right? That's an individual, it's not just the military. So it's kind of both and.
Interesting. Martin, anything you'd like to add to this?
okay.
No, all right. We have a question all the way in the back, please.
Good afternoon. Reinhard is from Tallinn University of Technology. I'd like to extend the, let's say, practical utility discussion on the escalation and also the Ukrainian example. So in my mind, if I put these two together, some of the assumptions in the escalation ladder start to fail. The escalation ladder seems to work, I think, really well if it's a two-body problem. So you can just, I do this thing, you do that thing, and then it's my turn again. But in a situation when you have numerous bodies, mostly operating anonymously, quite often under false flag, states do not have the monopoly of power or violence in cyber. The traditional model starts to break down. And I would like to just get a few comments in terms of if you are going to look at the escalation lattice or ladder in a multi-body problem where anonymity and false flag also play a role, how would you change that? Thank you.
Is this something you want to tackle?
Yeah. Okay. Now for an outpouring of opinion. If somebody's bombing you, you're probably not going to worry about cyber too much. Okay? Within a kinetic war, there are a few things you can do on cyber that can be considered escalatory, but it's really a few, and they probably don't apply in this case. Okay, now, this particular conflict actually has three parties in it, each of which are observing some sort of restraints. You've got Ukraine, you've got Russia, and you've got NATO. And there's a lot of incomparability between the two. And my best sense is that with one exception, Ukraine is not constraining itself because it's operating at the limits of its capabilities. And that one exception, and we can talk about this offline, is the extent to which Ukraine is not conducting operations against Russia. Okay? In terms of Russia's actions, we know they're not using nuclear weapons. But otherwise, it doesn't seem that Russia's operating under a whole lot of constraints, including constraints which we would like to think we would operate under because they're consistent with the laws of armed conflict, right? Mm-hmm. Such as bombing of hospitals. Okay, these appear to be operating in unconstrained manner. NATO, on the other hand, has a great deal of restraints that they are operating under because they're not a party to the conflict. So one constraint is we are not a party to the conflict. Another constraint is there may or may not be limits on the kind of equipment that NATO can give to Ukraine and Ukraine's ability to use it, okay? So you have very sharp asymmetries here. And asymmetries tend to be the enemy of thresholds because one of the human factors is not quite the term. One of the things that make us human is the notion of fairness. Okay, it is possible to have a threshold in which I accept a lower threshold than you do. And it may make sense strategically, but from a psychological point of view, that doesn't make a great deal of sense at all. Okay, so what you end up having in Ukraine, particularly from a NATO perspective, is the question of what is Putin's red line before he goes to nuclear weapons? And I haven't a clue what the answer is. I do know that NATO's perception of what the red line is has moved over the course of the conflict. Okay, so you had Robert Gates, former Secretary of Defense, and I have a quote from him back about a year or so ago that says, well, maybe we shouldn't be sending tanks to Ukraine because that would cross Russia's red line. And then I have another quote from him a year later saying, well, why aren't we sending F-16s, right? So his perception of Russia's red line has moved accordingly, Okay? When you have a threshold, there is some sort of notion that you have at least a tacit understanding. And right now, there is no tacit understanding of what the red lines are in Ukraine. For a large variety of reasons, but one of them is because the various asymmetries that are present in the conflict. Which wasn't really an answer to your question, but I thought I'd get out there anyway.
Do you want a clearer answer to your question? So you can squeeze something out of our other panelists, maybe?
Yeah, perhaps not the answer to the question, but an interesting answer nevertheless. Thank you very much. The point I was trying to really make was that even if you expand it to a three-body problem, those are three known bodies. But what are the unknown bodies who are sitting on the sidelines, basically trying to perhaps stoke more conflict out of it, between two or three of these actors? But I don't want to hijack the entire session, so I'm happy.
Don't worry, I'll tell you if you are. Grace, did you see any signs of this during your research?
Well, I think, right, because we're studying a warfighting context, I think it's not that Russia or Ukraine or all these actors aren't, I feel like they're going to try to pull out all the stops if they can because we're in a war. And so I think that's one of the takeaways, our implications, right? There are limits to the combat power of cyber operations, right? I think they're two totally different ball games. And so I think we do have escalation when it comes to conventional kinetic warfare. We're just not seeing that with cyber conflict, right? Because we're not seeing escalation if we look at it on a case study basis, right? A failed cyber attack is not followed by an increase in further cyber attacks or even a shifting gears into an escalation in terms of kinetic. But right, it's not that, I don't think a conclusion is we're not seeing cyber escalation because Russia's sitting on it or because Ukraine's sitting on it, because I think we've been in this war long enough where they would try to pull out all the stops. So I think it's just escalation looks inherently different in cyberspace because of the limits on the combat power of it, I would just add.
Baris, any thoughts on this?
Yeah, I think it's a little bit early to make some strong conclusions in this time. It's because we're still collecting data. We're still trying to understand what really is happening there. We have some data. We read some other reports as well. But I think it's going to take a little bit more time for us to understand who is working for who there, for what motivation, and what is their strategy, and so forth. That kind of question is still unanswered fully. So I think maybe the next year, CCDCOE, we would have a better place to answer a complete answer for you.
I suspect Rain will be here again next year and probably still hunting an answer to this. But what you're essentially saying is that we don't have complete situational awareness, and therefore we can't actually make this assessment.
We know what we see, we know what we see right now, and we will probably be in a better position when we have more information in the long run.
Interesting. Please.
Hi, I'm Phil Sherriff from Royal Holloway in London. Just picking up on the point you made about asymmetries. If you look at, for example, between Russia and the US, you've got considerable asymmetry from a cyber perspective in capabilities, targets, vulnerabilities, attack surfaces, dependencies, and implied asymmetries on the impact of society. How, when you talk about means and effects from a escalation perspective, how much more complicated does that make the discussion regarding escalation in cyber?
How much more complicated?
Yeah, we really want more complicated?
Single word answer, more?
The single word answer is yes, of course. If we're talking about a non-kinetic interaction between the United States, I'll say the United States and Russia, there are a number of asymmetries in cyberspace, but probably not as much as are in kinetic space. And the reason why is that many of the asymmetries in kinetic space arise from geography and allies. Okay, the United States has a lot of allies, Russia not so many. The United States has an ocean between it and all of its adversaries. Because we have allies, we don't necessarily have an ocean, right? All that goes away in cyberspace. Okay, in cyberspace, we're all dealing with the same underlying technology. There are no substantial differences between the way the United States and Russia generates electricity. There are no substantial differences in the way that we use, it's all the same Microsoft stuff, it's all the same TCP/IP, right? So there is a lot more symmetry in the cyber realm. Now, where there are asymmetries, the most obvious one are cyber attacks on political infrastructure, such as the 2016 attack on the DNC and others, because the role that elections play in the West is far different from the role that elections play in Russia. But apart from that, there is actually more symmetry in cyberspace. And that's because in cyberspace, everywhere is equidistant from everywhere else. Okay?
Good. Thank you. Anyone else like to add anything to this? No?
I would just do a caveat. I think there's more symmetry, but it doesn't level the playing field. I do think that the United States and NATO members have the resources to bolster, in terms of like, if we're just looking at defense, which we haven't really talked about. So I do think it levels some symmetries, but it doesn't totally level the playing field.
That's true. Baris?
I'm good.
Yeah, okay. We have time for one or two more questions before more coffee, please.
Colonel Bent Hansen from ACT in NATO ACT in Norfolk. Just with regard to your studies and the lessons learned we draw from it possibly, did you consider the following idea in your studies? So when we look at the war in Ukraine, I think we see two things. First, a strategic misperception on the Russian side from the get-go, and a conventional war that is not very much forward-leaning from the aggressor side. So they do the stuff they did in Second World War. Mm-hmm. Did you consider in your studies that the cyber domain might not have been the prominent idea of the Russians to even be used in this conflict?
Do you want to get into the psychology of the Russians?
Yeah, I can't speak to what they were thinking, but I do think that was an assumption we all had, that this would be kind of, if we were going to see a cyber war, this would be it. And just looking at the data, we don't see that cyber shock and awe. And so perhaps it wasn't even, again, we can't speak to kind of the Russian planning and intentions, but it hasn't been as effective. I think had Viasat been more effective and had it decapitated the Ukrainian command and control, that would have significantly, that could have had a profound effect on kind of the early stages of the war. But they were able to quickly recover Ukrainian forces, military. That was kind of, and we've seen a couple of attacks on the power grid, but those are quickly kind of limited and transient, and they're able to quickly fix it. So perhaps, I think it's just we're not seeing that. That was a big assumption that academics, policymakers alike had about this war. So maybe it is that Russia was just trying to focus instead on just kinetic, and cyber was just a bonus.
Can I ask you to speculate a bit? And I realize you probably prefer presenting data than speculating, but over the last decade, we've seen a lot of operations that have been publicly attributed to Russia targeting Ukraine. Do you think lessons learned from those operations and seeing the effectiveness of those operations might have led them to conclude that a conventional World War II style invasion might be just as effective?
Perhaps. I think it just speaks to like the takeaway, and this is something that's come up today and yesterday, is that Russia's fine with the low-hanging fruit, that it's fine with these kind of nuisance, disruptive attacks. Maybe that speaks to its capability. It doesn't have the offensive cyber capability to do something more impactful. Or it could be fine that they're fine with kind of the status quo, because for them, that's been working. They're still in the war. But yeah, I can't speak to what they don't have, but only what the data shows. And the data shows it's just been limited in the effects on the overall conflict.
We have time for one final question. We'll take one right here from our colleague.
Moscow Press, CCDCOE. Knowing that majority of the commanders on the Russian side were surprised by orders to march to Ukraine. And also knowing how they were failing to coordinate strategic rocket attacks with tactical activities on the front line. Aren't we drawing wrong conclusions and drawing wrong lessons identified based on what we have seen through the last year in relation with a Russian approach towards employment of cyber in conjunction with other operations?
Artemis, that's a question you ask when we have half an hour, not 90 seconds. Come on. Grace, do you want to try to tackle it? Is everything wrong?
I think, obviously, I was just speaking to assumptions that were made about this war. I think as we have more time and more data, right, my analysis ends in August 2022. That was several months ago. I think we'll learn more conclusions about the war. But I think people had certain ideas and perceptions about this war. We keep on going to this idea of perceptions. About what this war would look like and kind of pre-drawn conclusions. And I don't think that has necessarily played out. But I'm curious what the conversations and conclusions will be further out as we kind of get further out.
Would either of you like to add to this?
You want a quote from Hegel?
Sure, why not? That's a perfect day to go out on.
The owl of Minerva flies at dusk. In other words, ask me in 20 years and I'll tell you what happened.
Yeah.
That was a very academic
But Hegelian.
answer. It'll be spot on. So all that remains to me is to thank our panelists with a small token of our appreciation. Thank you so much, guys, for sharing your research with us all. Thank you so much.